Oh, we've got a local. We have Lucia from Kirkcaldy in Fife. Myself and Nick are both based in Glasgow.
Yep.
Oh, and we've
Fiona
got
from Edinburgh as well.
Donkin from Edinburgh. We've got Oliver from Shropshire.
Leamington Spa, nice. I don't actually know where that is. That's really ignorant of me. Where is Leamington Spa? I know like rough.
South.
It's one of those.
London? I don't know.
Londonish. Londonish. Welcome. Basingstoke. I know where Basingstoke is. Okay, I can manage that one.
Susan, I apologise for our combined ignorance of where Leamington Spa actually is.
Just south of Birmingham. So
just south of Birmingham. Okay. Okay, brilliant.
The middle of the Midlands.
Middle of the Midlands. Hi, Andrew. Fantastic. Great. So let's get started then today, shall we? I'm going to allow Nick to introduce himself, then I'll tell you who I am, then I'll let you know what kind of the format is going to be for this Q&A. So Nick, who are you?
Who am I? Good question. My name is Nick Ramsey. I am Director of Customer Success for Junction-18. We are, as you probably surmised, a Glasgow-based digital learning company, and we're very proud partners and supporters of the eLN and the wider kind of group and community. So yeah, I'm really happy to be able to be here today, hopefully shedding some insight into some of your questions in the current climate.
Fantastic. And I am Luke Merrick. I am a member of the Board of Directors of the eLearning Network, and I'm also the Head of Learning Design at Junction-18. And the way today is going to work is that Nick and I are going to start by discussing some of the questions that we've gathered from our network surrounding the challenges and opportunities presented by our current circumstances. So we're going to talk about a few of those, and then we're going to open it up to yourselves, our wonderful attendees. And there's two ways that you can submit your own questions for discussion. One is either you can put it straight into the chat, and then once we've finished discussing one question, I will pick it up and pose it to Nick and myself. Alternatively, if you'd prefer to do it in an audio way, just let me know that you have a question in the chat, and then I will unmute you so you can ask us verbally. We were waiting to see how many participants there would be before deciding whether to make this more, you know, a meeting context where everyone's unmuted, or whether to proceed with more of a webinar approach. But due to the numbers that swelled a little bit at the last minute, we decided to proceed with this sort of half and half approach, which may work, it may not work. It's a bit of an experiment. But there you go. Fantastic. And just to pick up on Joan's comment into the Zoom chat, please can you make sure that you've selected all panelists and attendees from the drop-down menu in the chat? Otherwise, only myself and Nick will get to benefit from your magnificent questions. And it's not automatically set to that. So please set your chat messages to all panelists and attendees. That would be great. Fantastic. Great. So, Nick, let's get started with some of the questions we've gathered from our networks. Question number one, we have, what way can you make learning engaging from a distance? So presumably this has been asked by somebody who, you know, the main modus operandi has been face-to-face training, and then suddenly COVID has hit, and they have this question.
Yeah. So I think obviously one of the immediate reactions to COVID is a lot of people are completely restricted in terms of obviously face-to-face and classroom training, and there's been a big move to Zoom, Adobe Connect, virtual classrooms, virtual training, and obviously eLearning and digital content as well. I think the challenging thing when you start to look at the development of content, that can sometimes be a bit of a a time consideration there, depending on what it is you want to develop. And we'll come back to that, I'm sure, another question in the conversation. My tips for making it engaging is to try and keep it as focused and as sharp as possible. I don't think, very much like converting face-to-face to an eLearn or digital learning, it's the same if you're running a virtual session. I don't think you can cut and copy whatever you would do in a classroom and take it online. It doesn't necessarily always work, and it won't necessarily engage your audience. So keeping it sharp and focused. I think as well, trying to still, if where possible, is to replicate some of the more interactive elements. So Zoom and Adobe Connect both have various features and functionality where you can make breakout sessions or groups and whiteboards. And I think it's really important to try and still maintain some of those elements into your sessions. And then the final thing as well, there's a lady I know called, I'm going to try and pronounce her name here because it's French, Hélène Benjani, who's a real expert on this, around making sure you very effectively prepare for your sessions as much as possible, so that if you are delivering things virtually, you still have a good solid structure, you have plenty of time for engagement, you've got plenty of time for reflection, and you're trying to create as a sort of equivalent experience as possible to the face-to-face sessions we obviously can do at the moment.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd really, there's so much that you can say about this in terms of making something engaging from a distance. I think digital is much less forgiving than, say, the classroom can be. So it's much more important to keep your message on point and keep it hyper relevant for the learners themselves or the end users, whoever it is you're targeting. So I think a key to making something engaging from distance for, say, e-learning is actually to make it very much focused on the relevant tasks that individuals need to be able to do on the job. So that means connecting any information you're delivering to, scenarios and to case studies and to real life examples to show that something is really relevant. And there's a lot of stuff you can do in and around it with gamification, but I mean, gamification is great, but it's not going to turn a average experience into an amazing one. You need to design an amazing experience to begin with, and that you do that by focusing around practical outcomes and connecting information to real life, in my view.
Definitely.
Yeah, and Joan mentioned there, temptation is to try and keep it similar duration. And that's an excellent point there. I think if you try and take a 3-hour classroom training and just convert it into a 3-hour online training, things aren't going to go really well, and the learners are going to have something to say about it, partly by just switching off or not completing the session, however it is. And we've got Joe there talking about making it personable, involving real life situations. So let's move on to the next question we have. Another question you have been asked, Nick, recently is, what shift in learning culture has COVID brought about? Or, in other words, what has changed or what should change? So, keeping it light with these questions so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I should make sure, I'll make sure my answer is a tactful one as well. Someone made to the point to me, and it's really valid, that I think organizations that had a good or a healthy learning culture before COVID will come out of this all the better, because they had the environment and the structure and the infrastructure for digital learning, for Zoom, etc., and all those things in place. But they also maybe had the attitude around allowing people to control and manage their own learning experiences and learner journeys. Other organizations maybe haven't made that step and made that jump, and then others, particularly perhaps in slightly let's just call them more traditional industries, maybe haven't even had that entry point, because all of their training or all of their learning is taking place, on construction sites or out in the field or whatever it be. So I think the biggest thing it's going to bring around is there will need to be a shift, not only potentially in the actual delivery of the learning, so around technology and infrastructure and everything else, but also in the actual mindset of how we deliver learning and content to people. I think there's a short-term consideration of however long this kind of is at its peak, and over the next kind of 3, 4, 5, 6 months, and as we see lockdowns start to come out and everything else. But beyond that, there's still a consideration for me around the culture within an organization, how we address learning is going to be different. And if it isn't, it absolutely should be, because it's what we've gone through is a fundamental change event.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we could really talk about in terms of what has changed and what should really change. And I think there's a big difference between what has changed and I suppose what we would like to change aspirationally, because working from the vendor side, both Nick and myself, I mean, we've worked with, hundreds of organizations, loads of, across dozens of sectors. So seeing the different sort of learning cultures or lack thereof in multiple different organizations kind of can give you a bit of pause for thought. So I think the way this has affected different organizations is, vastly different. And we've got Dawn there mentioning how for, those who are self-employed, maybe freelancers, there's a much greater awareness of the vast amount of free stuff that's out there. I think particularly for maybe, small organizations, part of that is part of the kind of shift that's happened is, curating resources from existing sources that are out there. And I think the literature, now I'm open to being corrected, but I believe some of the psychological literature mentions that it takes about 6 weeks on average to form a new habit. So I think in terms of what's been happening in lockdown so far, we've been in it for what, sort of 7-8 weeks. So I think in terms of habits that have been formed thus far, or habits that have had to have been formed due to circumstantial changes, I think we are definitely going to see things changing moving forward. Predicting what those are is incredibly difficult, and it's going to be different from organization to organization. I know certainly Nick and myself, we've got a few hopes of what will stick across different organizations. And I think one thing I'm hoping for is a more, for a granular approach to be a bit more commonplace. So rather than spending, 6 to 12 months creating these massive e-learning modules, in fact, a better way of approaching things is slightly more agile and creating smaller resources and learning experiences in smaller chunks that can be developed rapidly and spread out rapidly to meet needs that people actually have across an organization.
What are your hopes of what will stick, Luke?
Oh, excellent question, Fiona. Fiona's always got some excellent questions. My hopes, I think part of it is that there's more of a shift to focusing on kind of resources and creating learning experiences to kind of accompany them. And by learning experience, I just mean that there's some sort of format that you go through online, and it's this task-based experience where you need to complete scenarios, or you practice in a simulation where it's kind of, you're replicating what happens in real life or on the job in a digital space where people can practice. Ideally, I mean, there's some sort of realistic characters in there. It's not just customer A and customer B, but it's, Sandy, who's been with the firm, who's been a customer of the firm for 15 years and that sort of thing. So using realistic characters to help kind of engage different parts of memory. I think other hopes of what I hope will stick in terms of shifts to learning culture. I think seeing how much can be accomplished through digital, because I'm sure Nick will agree. We've talked to lots of clients and potential clients who amazingly enough, despite it being 2020, are still incredibly skeptical of e-learning or digital training, whatever you want to call it, and are very much unaware of what can actually be achieved digitally. So I think part of what is happening currently is that people are being forced to experience stuff. And that actually leads to one of the other questions I've been asked that I was planning on saving to a bit later, but it seems relevant now, given the track of what we're saying now. And that is, might this rapid shift from face-to-face to digital damage the prospects of digital? Specifically digital training?
Yes, is the easy answer to that question. And the reason I say that is because if like anything, if something isn't given the proper thought or consideration or strategy before implementation, then it can backfire quite severely and quite drastically. I think there are a lot of quick win solutions on the market at the moment, and I'm sure you've all seen them advertised here, there, and depending whether it's content or platform or system or whatever else. And um, taking anything like that on without actually measuring it up against what you needed to do is always going to be foolish. But by the same token, I think there's a lot of pressure for certain organisations. It's like, well, if we have an interruption or a kind of an interruption to our training program, that's going to have a wider kind of impact. So yes, I do think it could potentially have a detrimental effect. But that being said, I think when it's carefully thought out, I think when it's championed by the right people, when it's maybe one of the biggest things, again, I've been trying to urge people to think about at the moment is the idea of what learners actually need in this moment of time and over the next kind of period. So people are, they're working from home, they're juggling kids, they're juggling responsibilities. Some people might be coming out of furlough and getting back into work. So people are dealing with unbelievable amounts of, personal stress and difficult kind of circumstances. So for me, the learning needs to be very much about the absolutely fundamentals of what people need to do, and we shouldn't be overwhelming them and bombarding them with content. So it does have the risk of backfiring, and yes, it could become problematic, but by the same token, as to Luke's point, I think a lot of people will actually see the benefit and what it can do in terms of saving time, in terms of saving cost, in terms of levels of engagement. So yeah, I know Luke, you're very, very passionate about what that can kind of look like when it goes right.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think a lot of people are going to use what happens during this current time as justification for countering e-learning and digital training, purely because a lot of stuff has just been dumped online without any thought given to what companies want to achieve and what people need to be able to do and what people need to be able to do specifically in order to achieve the things the company wants to do. And it's just a case of throwing information at a topic, putting it online in the the online equivalent of basically a PowerPoint slideshow, and obviously that doesn't work. That doesn't lead to much retention. That doesn't lead to very good preparation for transferring that information to be applied in real life. So I think looking at the comments, a few people have mentioned. So I think Fiona and Joan have both mentioned firefighting and just putting stuff online. And Joan mentioned how, Laura Overton's mentions to us the other day that it's a lot of companies are reverting to the kind of stuff that was being done years ago in terms of they're just rapidly responding to things, but not taking a step back, analyzing the situation and deciding what is needed, and therefore, what do individuals need to know, and even finding out from individuals themselves, like what do they need? Because perhaps it's not a training course they need. Perhaps they need a checklist, or perhaps they need a new headset, or perhaps they need some new software for handling incoming calls, or whatever it may be. Or maybe they need, a short, a 2-minute tutorial video, not a 30-minute e-learning module. So like Ruth's mentioned as well, pushing out content too quickly, just info dumping. And going back to the question, I think we'll see organizations that do use that as a justification for going, the other way and reversing almost entirely to face-to-face training. It really does depend on the quality of things, and people within those organizations are going to need some digital learning evangelists really to say, okay, look, you experienced this, that was terrible. I agree, I designed this stuff and I agree that was really bad, but it can be really good. There is amazing things that you can achieve. And while I'm all for face-to-face training, and that needs to be part of like a whole learning approach and ecosystem, because there's stuff that you can achieve in a classroom with a bunch of people that you can't necessarily achieve half as well in a purely digital sense. I think I think it's going to be a bit tricky moving forward.
Definitely.
Yeah. And then moving on to another question that we've been given. This one was actually handed to me by Joan, and it's in two parts. The first part, Nick, is how are people coping with the sudden pivot from face-to-face and digital? And the second, which is almost what we've covered already a little bit, will this lead to any meaningful long-term change?
Yeah, Jones also just asked an excellent question that kind of ties directly into both of those. So is there an ethical dilemma here, and should we allow clients to make us duff eLearn? And so do we accept a lower standard or lower quality of eLearning for the time being? I think some people are handling it. Some organisations I mentioned beforehand were probably better geared up and prepared for this than others, so they might have had their systems and some content and everything in place, so it's easier for them to transition, taking things online, and particularly some of the larger, more financial services or technology type organisations. They will have the means in place to allow people to work and in turn learn remotely. Others are going from, as I mentioned before, almost 0 to 100 very, very quickly. And I think they are probably the ones that will find it a bit more difficult and a bit more challenging with that pivot, because they've got so much to do and so much to think about. I mean, some people are still having to, training people to unmute themselves on Zoom when they're doing a call, never mind trying to get them to have, these very complex, in-depth sessions around whatever the material topic might be. I think the bigger consideration for me around that is that as we enter the remainder of the year, compliance learning and compliance training will inevitably start to come back up for people. So health and safety, fire safety, GDPR, financial compliance, everyone's hot favorite topics, but a lot of organizations will have been reliant on delivering that in classrooms or in person, and it simply just might not be an option for them at that particular moment in time. I do worry that is going to raise, to Joan's point, that is going to become an ethical dilemma. Can you accept a really, I almost said a bad word, can you accept a really bad e-learning course as a kind of a plaster, or to get people through learning and training for this particular crisis period? The answer is probably yes, you can do it. It's not going to be an engaging experience. It's not going to have a huge impact on the learner, and then that might become a detrimental thing to the wider digital agenda within the organisation. So to the point that you were making about the long-term strategy, people's memory of it might be like, during lockdown I had to do this horrible fire safety course online and I found it really unengaging. So it is a bit of a balance and a bit of a trade-off between the wants and needs of the organisation, or sometimes external pressures, versus the quality and output of the learning experience. So it's ethical dilemma is a really nice way of putting it, Joan. I agree. And I think that's a choice that the organisations will need to kind of make.
Yeah, and I think the answer to Joan's question around it being an ethical dilemma, should we allow clients to make us duff e-learning? I think it depends on who your clients are. Because if you're sort of like us and you work from an external side and you're a vendor for multiple different organizations, I think that there is only so much you can do and say to sort of consult and make recommendations to clients. And if at the end of the day, if they don't take on board what you're saying, we can't force them to do that. Whereas I do think if you're part of an internal team and you've engaged stakeholders for a fair amount of time, you've built some relationships, and you've basically got a team around you in your department, but also elsewhere, who can sort of advocate for your approach to things. I think you can take a slightly firmer approach to requests for learning interventions when they do come in, and you can bounce back a bit more robustly than, say, a vendor can, because if we're a bit too robust, then that paints us in quite a bad light, and that's not great. So I think it depends on who your clients are, really. But I think my approach from a vendor side of things is that if I have a mental scale of, say, 1 to 10 in terms of the quality and predicted effectiveness of any solution that myself or my team design and that we at Junction-18 create. And so maybe a client comes to us and they're asking for a 1 out of 10 project, which is basically going to be trash and a waste of everybody's time. I see it as a success if I can take that 1 out of 10 project and progress it to a 2 out of 10 or a 3 out of 10 or 4 out of 10 project, because then that means that at least the end user, the learner themselves, is going to have a much improved experience. It's going to be much better for them. It's going to be more beneficial to them by, myself and my team advocating for and making recommendations of like, well, I understand that's what you want to achieve, but what the better way to achieve it would be by doing it in this way, which may take a little bit more time or a bit less time or whatever. It may require a bit more time from your SMEs to refine things a little bit, but this is going to end up achieving what you want to do. So I think that's part of my approach to it, because we don't always have the power to control individuals' approaches to things. And if they want some junk project, we always make a recommendation and we try and make an effort to improve it rather than just act as customer service and say, yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir, here is your 1 out of 10 junk project. We always try and improve things by a certain measure, even if sometimes it's an incredibly small measure, but it is some measure which does improve things. And then that can sort of build a platform for the next time we deal with that client for us to improve things. And then they come with us next time, maybe with a 3 out of 10 project, which we are then able to progress to maybe 5 out of 10 or 6 out of 10 in terms of the long-term effectiveness for individuals.
Yeah, I think so Jason and Fiona both kind of make a really good point there. And for me, I don't want to use the phrase stages because it's maybe a bit sensitive for people at the moment, but there's almost 2 stages for me where, in Fiona's example, there is that what people do in this sort of short-term quick fixes, getting things online via Teams and Lookup, as Fiona have done. But as she mentioned, they're then looking at a full eLearning course for their induction. I think a lot of organizations will begin to do that, where they think about, okay, well, looking at the longer term and the bigger picture, what content can we take, into a digital setting, and what will provide us with the most, kind of longevity around that as well, which is really interesting to me. Bala also, who's joining from Singapore, which is really cool. Bala asks, where do you see AR, VR in learning? Is there a good business case for learning out there, or does it still need some time to be proven? Luke, I'll let you have a shot at that one.
Sorry, question from Bala. Okay, where do you see AR, VR in learning? I think I'll start with VR because I've done some more work on that before than I have AR. Sorry, virtual reality I find is most effective in a couple of situations, mainly ones where it's really difficult to replicate circumstances in real life. So either because it's really dangerous to the individual, to the learner themselves, or because it's just incredibly disruptive to try and set things up in that way. So for an example of the dangerous side of things would be, related to chemicals, or, chemicals used for explosions in the building industry. If people get the combinations wrong in real life, they will die. So therefore, VR is the perfect solution for getting people to practice combining chemicals in a safe environment, or perhaps say working at heights. You don't necessarily want somebody to be trying to work at height from the first time when they've had absolutely zero practice. So you'd want to give them practice, and VR would be a great way of doing that. And then another way of, so in a situation where it's going to be very difficult to actually set it up, let's say somebody needs to practice going around shops and looking for errors in labeling, or looking for things that need cleaning up and messing up. That's very difficult to set up when it's in real life, because there's customers, there's stock taking, there's all sorts of things need to happen. So I think in VR, VR works best for any situation in real life that is difficult or dangerous to set up. I think I've seen a lot of VR used for just face-to-face interactions, which I think that's not where its maximum impact is, because you can spend a quarter of the money and still have a simulation where there's a face-to-face interaction. and it will have this exact same impact from a learning point of view as if you did it VR. So I think just conversations with individuals, that's not necessarily the best application for VR. And then quickly, in terms of AR, augmented reality, I think augmented reality, I'm not an expert on AR. I've not done work with it. So there are people who know a lot more about this than me. But in my mind, AR is an excellent way of providing resources and information to people when they're actually on the job. Because then you're using a camera, you're looking around a certain area or a piece of equipment, and that can bring up additional information that you need to know about that piece of equipment. So I think that's an excellent way of basically delivering resources in a bite-sized way when people are actually on the job. But the problem with AR and VR is, well, you can see it as a problem. It's the time and the cost, which have been coming down in the last sort of 5 to 7 years. But it is still going to take, quite a long time to get a VR AR solution created. So I hope that answers your question somewhat, Bala. But like I said, I'm not the best person to ask about AR. Got to be honest there. I'm not gonna pretend. And then we've got another question from the chat here from Jessica. How do you dampen the enthusiasm for using new tech or new interactive approaches when a simple micro-learning solution would do without looking unambitious, such as should make an effective 2-minute tutorial and not a VR video game? It's a good question right there.
Yeah, I think it comes down to managing the expectations of the stakeholders or the whoever your customer is in that particular instance. Often you will find that someone will come up with a novel idea that a game or videos or scenarios or something might be a really novel approach to deliver a piece of learning, when in reality, to Jessica's point, it might not necessarily need anything as big or as grand, as complex as that. So I think just being very clear and concise about how you present and explain your ideas back to people is definitely helpful. So show them, why you think that, and what it might look like and what the shape could be. But yeah, it's trying to gently steer people away from their sometimes they have a very firm idea of what they want. So you have to kind of take them on this journey with you to explain around, the benefits of your approach. But absolutely, I fully advocate for, where possible, things should be far more short, digestible, resource-based. And if you can use, gamification scenarios, videos, great. You don't always have to. It really comes down to learning. And yeah, to Joe's point, quoting the budget for a proper VR project can often deter that enthusiasm as well, because to Luke's point, it isn't the cheapest thing in the world to do or to do well. So Joan asks another question: what about tapping into the existing expertise in the organisation and encouraging them to create user-generated content? And that might be a workable solution, especially for all Zoom experts. We've actually done that for one of our clients at the moment. For the contact center audience globally, they've used it as a means of sharing tips and best practice, and is exactly that. It's very much, people just recording video on their smartphone, telling top tips or about their story, and then we managed to kind of string that and pull it together in a really nice, short, succinct video format where people can kind of tap into it. So yeah, I really think user-generated content can be a very effective solution, but particularly when it's around communication pieces. If you're just trying to get across, maybe best practice, or this is what I did and it worked really well, I think it's a very effective tool. And Luke, I know you've been directly involved in that project as well.
Yeah, I think in terms of user-generated content, that's a really productive way of meeting kind of learner needs around applying what they've learned to a new situation, or applying what they've learned when it's quite a big change actually, and it's a change to how things are doing. Like suddenly we're doing this in this way, and having that sort of social learning side of thing and user generated content is a great way of supporting performance moving forward, and supporting people as they try and apply what's been learned previously. That's not something that can be achieved through a formal learning intervention in digital. In fact, the digital can give people the core messages and concepts they need to know. It can give them an experience in which they need to practice things, some simulations, some scenarios. But then when it comes to actually doing stuff in the job, they need some support in the workflow, and user-generated content, social chatting, in Slack or Yammer or Teams or whatever it is a really helpful way of meeting those particular learner needs of, in the moment, I don't know what to do in this situation. Has anyone else encountered this yet? Because it wasn't, you can't cover everything, and you shouldn't try and cover everything in a formal learning intervention.
Cool.
Fantastic. So anyone else got any questions, please feel free to dump them in the chat.
Do they have to be about learning specifically? Personal questions. How do you get your hair to look so good in lockdown? That's what I want to know.
My wife and a borrowed pair of clippers and several prayers prior to my hair being cut. That is.
And I'm going to make another attempt at mine later on. It's not going to be pretty, let me tell you that.
Fun, as long as it's functional. I'm just having a look through the chat, see if there's any questions I've missed.
It's amazing how many guys I've seen on Teams meetings where they have like their children cut their hair. I would not like my I would not like my child anywhere near my hair. Or maybe I should. Maybe I should just go for it.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Not suggesting you did. Just I like that clarity. Thank you for that. No, yeah. This is all DIY myself.
I just want to mention something that Bella raised a little bit earlier. Just need to find there we go. Saying challenges for L&D has been to present a business case and ROI given the huge investment of AR VR. So just a brief something on sort of business cases. I think a strong way of building a business case is to put forward a number, ideally a number in the form of pounds or dollars or whatever the currency is. And I think one of the best ways of coming up with that is by linking the training or whatever intervention you're trying to do to specific behaviors, and then having those behaviors linked to any sort of measures that are currently in place. So if we take it from a health and safety point of view, and it's say slips, trips, and falls, if the organization you work for or within or have as a client, they're probably going to have some sort of measure for slips, trips, and falls or health and safety incidents. So if you take that and then make one of the objectives of the intervention to decrease the number of slips, trips, and falls recorded per annum by, I know you can be conservative, you could say 5%, and contribute towards that, then that can give you a solid goal, which is easier to align with sort of the business goals that are happening currently. And I think in certain instances, you can link that then to finances. So for example, if there's been a number of, cases raised where employees have been given settlements or cash as a result of injuries sustained in the workplace, then there is a case you can say hypothetically there is a chance that we could reduce the number of claims made, which could be a little bit too far. It really depends on what you're measuring and how, but I think if you link what it is you're trying to achieve to real world business outcomes, and then from that you figure out, well, are we saving people time? Are we saving the company money? Are we saving the company any problems? So an example of that I've done before, a few years ago, did a project for a FTSE 100 company. It was a project for managers around the world. There's sort of the audience of 11,000 or so, and we created a basically a replacement course for individuals based on a course which did take managers 5 days to complete in Switzerland, plus then 6 hours of e-learning on the back of that. And there was a lot of things we did, mainly, you know, breaking it down into small chunks, focusing on, like I was saying earlier, focusing on specific actions people need to be able to do in the workplace that related to the topic, and then reducing the amount of content so that, you know, we only included stuff people actually needed to know in order to achieve and perform those actions. And that cut the content down into, I think we cut it down into, you know, 8 or 9 short 15-minute modules. And I think part of the kind of the ROI on that was saying how we intended, you know, we saved each manager in the organization, or each frontline manager in the organization, about 50 hours per year in terms of the training. And then from that, we could extrapolate kind of a monetary value. So that's an example of what I'm talking about, Bella, but I fully recognize that's more a descriptive answer of something that I've seen, rather than that. You can't be prescriptive about that and say, this is how it must be done. That's more just to illustrate what we're talking about. Just checking the comments again. Anything you want to add to that, Nick?
No, I think you've answered that really well. Jessica asks, have you noticed any change in client needs or wants for accessibility during the pandemic? I'm going to make an assumption there. If you think about accessibility from like a kind of access and content point of view, I think there will probably need to be a shift moving forward. A lot of companies have content locked down inside firewalls and inside servers and things, and they potentially need to look at ways to open that content up to people. So potentially a slightly different model around that, I think, will become prevalent over the next kind of year or two. Accessibility from a content design point of view, I don't think there's been any change in that, not from ours. I mean, it's always something that we have, I guess, in the forefront of our minds, Luke. So I don't know if you've seen any change in that.
I've not seen a major shift in that. It could be something that happens within other organizations. I've not seen anything yet, but I think it has very much, going back to comments mentioned earlier, it has very much been kind of a firefighting season for a lot of organizations. So I think perhaps one of the kind of longer term outputs will be, you know, learners feeding back to the organizations that actually, while I was working at home and had to complete this course, you know, I couldn't actually follow it because it wasn't accessible to me, because, you know, for any sort of different abilities reason, perhaps listening difficulties, visual difficulties, or perhaps neurodiverse reasons could be the case there. But as of yet, I've not seen much, but I mean, that could be part of kind of the fallout moving forward in terms of people highlighting the need for greater accessibility in the design of experiences and resources, when currently perhaps it's not accessible enough.
Yeah, I guess if it's been used more widely as well, I think a lot of legacy content will come under perhaps more scrutiny on that basis as well. I think some of the bigger content libraries out there, you could look at the content and have a very strong argument that it isn't accessible. And John just said, don't mention Flash. Yes, if it isn't Flash, you'll encounter some issues and challenges. Certainly moving forward.
Fantastic. Well, I think we've had some fantastic questions today. Thank you everybody for participating. I'm going to wrap things up a little bit, and I'm going to mention some of the forthcoming events from the eLearning network. And just a reminder, this webinar Q&A has been done with the eLearning network in partnership with Junction-18, and eLearning network forthcoming. We have on the 14th of May, so in 2 days' time, there is a webinar on creating a portfolio of work with Dominic Rimbold and eLN director David Price. So particularly relevant for anyone who's going to be looking for a new role or is perhaps a freelancer or self-employed. On the 15th of May, so also this week, there is a webinar on mentoring and the reflective practitioner with eLN directors Christine Locker and Jane Davids, who are both excellent people, worth dialing in. And then on the topic of members' coffee mornings that Fiona mentioned, we have an eLN members' coffee morning on the 21st of May, which is next week. That is for members only, but if you're not currently a member of the eLearning network, it only costs £29 per year, and it gives you access to a whole bunch of different benefits that you have and some exclusive content and digital events. You can find out more at elearningnetwork.org for that. And then towards the end of May, on the 22nd, we have another webinar, Make a Connection, Serious Games and Remote Learning Experiences with eLN industry partner Make Real. And then finally, 29th of May, closing out the month of May, there's a webinar, Digital Learning After the Reset with Miles Runham and eLN partner Toby Harris from Filtered. So we've got some fantastic events coming up in the rest of May. Thank you everybody for your time. Oh, and it's a workshop rather than a webinar on portfolios. So the event on portfolios on the 14th of May, that is a workshop. So bring what you have regarding portfolios with you, and then Dominic Rimbold and David Price will help you out. That sounds fantastic. Okay. And there will be details announced of another Twitter chat, eLearning Network Twitter chat. Details of that will be released in the next couple of weeks. Thanks everybody for attending. Appreciate the questions, appreciate the comments. And I hope that what Nick and I have said has had some value. Hopefully it's, provoked some thoughts, given a little bit of inspiration, some ideas, that sort of thing. But thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care. Be safe. Cheers, folks.